60% of the time when people think I'm wrong, they're wrong. 35% of the time it's a misunderstanding. The other 5% of the time they may have a point. One thing that I've learned over time is that everyone has blind spots and everyone makes mistakes. There is a well-established history of cheap pilots and check airmen screwing things up. There's an even better track record of line pilots doing the same thing. And let's not get started on general aviation. The point here is that everyone's prone to committing errors. The person who won't fess up to it is an obtuse liar. The artifact of a mistake is blame, which isn't very effective from a flight safety standpoint. When something happens with an adverse consequence, particularly something that causes a fatality, our gut response is to assign fault, followed immediately by accusing the person of a moral deficiency. The problem with this is that it covers up a very important fact that people aren't trying to make mistakes, they're not trying to get themselves killed, and moralizing about it obscures the reality that many of the mistakes that get people killed in the right circumstances will get us killed too. And to the extent that it doesn't, it'll be because we learned from their errors. Now there's another side to mistakes, which is that the error rate is dependent on the time that you have to make a decision. There's an interesting feature here too. Too much time making a decision can result in an adverse response. With too much time on your hands, you'll inevitably become ensnarled with minutiae. You'll give undue weight to less relevant details. With proper time constraints, you'll be more likely to restrict your focus to significant implications, which are the implications that generally produce the best results. On the flip side, in an environment with excessive time compression, you might not be able to figure out what to focus on. You'll be purely reactive. In combat or while flying an airplane, sometimes there's nothing you can do to avoid these events. If a cylinder swallows a piston 50 feet off the runway, you're going to have to be reactive. You don't have time to think things through. This, of course, is where training comes into play. Fly the airplane, get the right amount of rudder in, maintain safe airspeed, and pick a place to put the aircraft down if you don't have the performance to get back to the airport. If you're in a multi-engine aircraft, you'll know whether you have the performance to get back to a runway if you've done a few performance calculations prior to departure. Now, when you're covering an accident, the more time you spend gathering information and considering the details, the less likely that you'll make a mistake in coverage. But even here, things can get sticky. In many cases, there's a limit to the details that can be gathered. Sometimes you're forced into speculation, which is a reactive form of deduction. You also have to balance timeliness with comprehensiveness. If there's something that's killing people, you want to make them aware of it as soon as possible in order to preserve lives. But in making them aware of it as soon as possible, you might make a mistake. So when we roll back to me saying that I'm right at least 95% of the times, it's because I generally take a little time researching an incident before I cover it. You might be wondering right now why I'm talking about this. I got some comments on my last video on VMC, which stands for Velocity Minimum Controllable Airspeed for a twin aircraft that's experienced an engine failure. In these videos, there's always someone who will point out a tidbit that they think that I got wrong. Sometimes it's a little inert, the pronunciation of a city name. Sometimes it's a little bit more topical, a theory or technique I described that they disagreed with. This last video, I got a little bit more of that than I'm used to, and the volume on it was a little bit higher, so I wanted to address that right now. And as I get started, it's important to emphasize that one of the most important features of aviation safety is the ability and willingness to offer and accept critique. Every training program you've ever gone through involves someone giving you critique, and if you're going to maximize the advantage of it, you need to accept it. But this doesn't restrict you from offering critique back. And the trick is that, while there are approaches for offering critique that are less combative and more effective, it's often impossible to critique someone without making them feel bad. That's why it's important not to critique people over frivolous things, but at the same time, when you're dealing with aviation safety, it's important to be direct, which is to say, sometimes a little insensitive. Now, as it relates to my last video, which referenced the Cessna 310 VMC crash in Santa Fe a couple of months ago, there were a few things that I wanted to clear up. The first is that aileron authority is not what limits VMC speed, rudder authority is. I actually dropped a comment into that video 30 minutes after I published it about this. Reviewing the video, I realized that I hadn't mentioned something that was obvious to me when I recorded it, but I failed to mention it explicitly. That is that VMC occurs due to rudder limitations at slower airspeed. I spent a good portion of the video referencing aileron authority because operationally that's what the pilot is struggling against when the aircraft begins to roll uncontrollably. These roll forces are the result of rudder limits, but the inability to arrest the roll rate is due to aileron limits. Operationally speaking, pilots are very attuned to what the ailerons are doing, while the rudder is used far less often. In the midst of a VMC event, pilots are much more likely to notice a lack of roll authority as opposed to the rudder being at full stop. In either case, the proper response is to reduce power and increase airspeed, which means point the nose down. Now, if you're at low altitude, your proximity to the ground may produce an impulse that makes that last part nearly impossible. I also got comment on my use of the term coordinated flight. I was referring to the ball or yaw coordinator being centered. The technical definition relates to the path of the aircraft through the slipstream. In this case, I was again referring to it from an operational standpoint, which is to say how a pilot in flight will experience it. You're going to feel a little crooked with the ball half out of center, which is almost always an indication of uncoordinated flight. You can expect this going forward from me. I don't have a problem with technical accuracy or tight definitional standards, but when you jump into the flight environment, you're not going to experience things in a dictionary sense. You're going to experience them in a kinetic sense. In this particular case, the technical definition of uncoordinated doesn't mean much to a pilot who's staring through their ear hole. In conjunction with this, I had a few commenters who insisted that weight does not influence VMC. There is quite a bit of intransigence on this. Definitions are important, but getting lost in them can create confusion. What I said in the video wasn't controversial, but the truth of the matter is that it's lift that reduces VMC. Lift is largely dependent on weight, so like the deal with the ailerons and rudder, it's a flip side of the same coin. But to be fair, it's also a little bit more complex than that. Specifically, an increase in weight decreases VMC, which is a good thing, but it also decreases performance, which is a bad thing. The truth of the matter is that the positive impact on VMC is far less useful than the negative impact on performance is potentially dangerous. If you have less weight, you have more single-engine performance. This will make you less likely to slow down to an unsafe speed in a trade-off for a better climb. So even though lighter weights have an adverse impact on VMC, you'll generally be better off with the lighter aircraft due to better performance. Now, like I said, the reason why VMC decreases with increased weight is because in steady state flight, lift must increase as well. I use the term inertia when describing this, which bothered some people. It sort of falls into that 5% my error category. I was being a little too loose with the phrase inertia. I wasn't wrong in the way I was using it, but I was kind of using it wrong. So what happens with more weight is that in level flight, you're producing more lift. If you're maintaining ball half out of center, the lift component will be slanted to counter the rudder forces, which result in the aircraft flying directly into slipstream, which is what you want. It doesn't matter what attitude you're in, ball half out of center will cause the lift vector to be oriented with the rudder, which will decrease VMC as long as the aircraft is producing 1g of lift, which is the same as saying that lift equals weight. In a turn, lift will exceed weight in order to counterbalance the vertical component of lift that's lost from rotating the aircraft off the horizon. This increase in lift will cause VMC to reduce, but again, this positive impact on VMC is countered by the fact that loading up the wing increases induced drag and decreases performance. So when the certification standards reference weight with regards to VMC, what they're really getting at is lift. I also stated that most twins would obtain their lowest VMC speed at a bank angle over 5 degrees. I mentioned that the FAA limits manufacturers to a maximum of 5 degrees bank in order to establish published VMC speeds. One of you questioned my assertion that most twins were better off with more bank. You stated your understanding that most twins were better off with 2 to 3 degrees of bank. I think that I'm technically still right, but there's a point here as well. For those of you in the training environment, you're probably flying light twins that are relatively low performance, see less expensive. The amount of bank needed to produce zero slipstream is dependent on the lever arm between the engine and the aircraft and the amount of power that that engine produces. This determines how much rudder force is required to arrest yaw, which correlates to how much bank angle is needed in order to optimize performance. If you factor in turboprops, the vast majority of twins produce enough power so that VMC is lowest utilizing a bank angle above 5 degrees while maintaining a constant heading. That being the case, you should follow the published guidance in your aircraft's particular manual. If it says 5 degrees, it's probably over 5 degrees, but just fly what it says. If you're in a light twin with relatively low performance where an engine failure is going to be more critical, 2 to 3 degrees may actually be better. Again, follow manual guidance. Training guidelines are tricky business because they generalize responses that are often aircraft dependent. For example, clubbing the power or prop levers forward is a sort of thing that can napalm a World War II era radial. Yet many twin training documents instruct pilots to push power, propellers, and mixture full forward in the event of an engine failure. What you have to understand is that these guidelines assume a student who is picking up initial twin experience, which is almost exclusively done in lower cost light twins. One complaint that circulated online is that if your mixture is properly set for takeoff, pushing the mixture forward will only serve to decrease performance. This is technically true, but you have to measure the mild decrease in performance with the potential to regain a bunch of thrust. Let's describe the effects of mixture here real quick. Each molecule of fuel requires so many molecules of air, in particular oxygen, in order to burn. When you push the mixture forward, you can introduce an excess of fuel into the cylinder. The thing of it is, too much fuel is less problematic than too little fuel, at least in the short term. With too little fuel, the engine will rapidly lose power to the point where it may shut down altogether. With too much fuel, you will, in essence, be slowly dumping fuel overboard via the exhaust. You can only burn the amount of fuel that you have the oxygen for. The rest will simply depart your tank via a journey through the cylinder. And while it's true that it will rob a touch of power by displacing air, it's really not that much. The main reason to lean an engine is to make fuel consumption more efficient, which is important not only for economics, but also to avoid exceeding calculated fuel burn. The thing about training guidelines is that they propose universal solutions into environments that can be very particular. This actually applies to the regulations at large as well. That's why they have FAR 91.3 for general aviation pilots, which states that a pilot in command can deviate from any regulation to the extent it is required in order to address an emergency. There's a correlate for this which also applies to corporate and airline pilots. Now back to the engine failure. If an engine fails due to the cylinder head separating from the block, or if it swallows a piston, there's going to be a fury of noise and vibration. In these cases, you're going to know off the bat that there is no hope in trying to fire the engine back up, which means that there's no reason to increase prop RPM or mixture. On the contrary, you want to cut fuel supply off to the damaged engine, and you want to reduce drag on the airplane. What you want to do first is clearly identify which engine has failed, verify that you're grabbing the correct mixture and propeller lever, and bring them full aft to fuel cutoff and feather. However, if the engine simply stops producing power, it's possible that power can be restored. Mixture shouldn't spontaneously change during a takeoff, but a loose connection or a change in intake dynamics could potentially cause the mixture to become overly lean. Not to mention the possibility of a passenger bumping the mixture lever with their knee. It's cheap to push the mixture forward and find out. You don't have to wait long. If it's a solution, it's going to solve the problem real quick. Now, I'm not trying to linger on the Santa Fe Cessna crash, but it is illustrative for a few things. It seems possible, if not likely, that the propeller was never feathered in this particular case. VMC speed will be noticeably reduced with the feathered propeller because less rudder is needed to overcome the increased drag on the failed engine. A high RPM propeller on a failed engine aerodynamically produces drag as though it were a solid circular plate in the diameter of the propeller arc. A feathered propeller produces a pittance in comparison. And while the published VMC speeds assume a high RPM setting for the propeller on the Cessna 310, published single-engine climb performance assumes a feathered propeller. In other words, a relatively light turbo twin may have published single-engine climb performance up to 500 feet per minute, but if you don't feather the prop, you may not even be able to maintain altitude. If you're in a light twin and lose power soon after takeoff, particularly if the loss is accompanied by indication of damage to the engine, identifying the propeller and getting it feathered is a high priority. The emphasis here is on identifying the propeller first. If you feather the good engine, you've just become a 6,000-pound glider with a stubby wing. Now there's another complaint online that the air traffic controller shouldn't have vectored the aircraft into a turn into the failed engine.
51 Charlie's got an engine failure. 51 Charlie, roger, you make the left turn to runway 33. 51 Charlie, you're clear to land any runway you want. Winds are calm. 51 Charlie, I'm going to get some altitude. All right.
The ADS-B data indicates that the aircraft suffered a failure in the left or the number 1 engine, but when you listen to the audio transcripts, it's not apparent which engine failed. There's no particular reason to think that the tower controller had access to that information. And even if he did, you have to understand that air traffic controllers don't know aircraft-specific procedures. In this case, there's no specific procedure that limits the ability to turn into a failed engine. The reason why is that you're not going to adversely impact performance by doing it. But more broadly speaking, it's important for pilots to understand that controllers don't know aircraft-specific procedures in the first place. I reached out to a retired air traffic controller on this topic. He described to me air traffic controllers' duties in these circumstances. Not surprisingly, that doesn't involve providing guidance to pilots on aircraft-specific procedures. If you declare an emergency or say something that the controller construes as declared an emergency, such as, "I've lost an engine," they're going to coordinate with radar and ground controllers to clear the airspace around you and to keep aircraft away from the runways. At some point, they might hand traffic off to other controllers to decongest the frequency, and they'll also notify crash and fire rescue. There's no formal training requirement for controllers to be familiar with aircraft capabilities, pilot procedures, or techniques. I mean, if you think about it a little bit, this is pretty obvious. Pilots at any given time are only responsible for one aircraft, the one they're flying in. Controllers, during a shift, may handle dozens of different aircraft types. They have no hope of being useful for pilots on all of those different airframes. As a pilot, you're responsible for being aware of your airplane, including performance capabilities and required checklist items. Also emphasized by this individual was the need for pilots to clearly communicate their intentions and the nature of the emergency. It's not controllers' job to tell you what you should be doing, it's your job to tell them what you need to be doing. In this case, flying straight out, avoiding terrain, and reconfiguring the aircraft for single-engine operation. Everything else is secondary. With the Santa Fe crash, it looks as though the pilot became too focused on immediately maneuvering to land the aircraft instead of proceeding straight out, gaining altitude, and getting the aircraft configured via engine failure procedures, which would have included feathering the propeller. The tower controller attempted to assist him with the shortest turn to a cross runway. This may have influenced the pilot's decision to make a turn instead of proceeding straight out, but that's not the controller's fault. Like it or not, it's up to the pilot to establish their needs. In this particular case, the initial communication should have gone like this. Cessna 51 Charlie, Mayday, 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 my number one engine's failed. I need to proceed straight out. Running checklist, be with you in a minute. Now, in a multi-crew environment, you can do more things at once. In the airlines at this point, the first officer will generally fly the aircraft and communicate for a safe return to a suitable runway, while the captain performs the engine out checklist items. Establishing a safe maneuvering altitude before moving the lift vector away from vertical and reducing performance in a turn is a responsibility of the pilot, as is establishing proper configuration for the aircraft. You can't hand these responsibilities off to air traffic control. What the controller can do is ensure emergency services are available to you, update wind conditions, and provide vectors to establish the aircraft on final. I've got some more recreations on deck. Hopefully I'll be dropping these fairly soon. In the meantime, stay safe and keep the blue side up.
51 Charlie, runway 33 is just off your left side. That might be the closest one for you. 28's a little bit further to the north, but your choice. The crash rescue one appears the aircraft is down, but well off the field, about 2 miles off the approach end.